The reason I call it outer boundaries, by the way, it's the furthest out you're going to go that you're going to expect people to believe or swallow. Like, I just want you to believe that people can breathe in space. I need you to believe that. So you set it up right away and people will buy it. You can't spring that on them an hour into your story.
Hello, and welcome to You Are a Storyteller. In this episode, Brian and Jesse discuss why outer boundaries matter in storytelling. Without taking the time to set boundaries in the first act, you miss out on an emotional bond with your audience, and you fail to create parameters for what's believable in the story that follows.
This week's episode, we're going to talk about outer boundaries. But before we get into that, I wanted to kick off with an idea that you and I were geeking out about last night, because I think it's a helpful framework. Okay. So just hang on with me.
Okay.
So the other day I heard this trainer say this thing kind of offhanded, and it blew my damn mind. She said, remember, you need to always know the difference between racing and training. And I was like, okay. And she said, when you're racing, it's all about going to your strength. And I was like, all right. And she said, the difference is that the other 95% of the time, you're not racing, you're training, which is not about going to your strength. It's about the opposite. It's going directly to your weakness and making your weaknesses strong. And I was like, I don't know if it just hit me at the right time, but I was like, I had to stop what I was doing and write that down. I was like, racing or training, because the big problem is if you think you're always racing, you will. It's like the one person at the gym that all they do is work out one arm, and they got this big butt. It's like, but they're really weak in every other spot, right? Yeah. But you and I were geeking out about that idea of racing or training. Mm-hmm. First one is focus on your strengths versus focusing 100% on your weaknesses. Where am I weakest? You also seem to respond to that. What was it that stuck out to you with that?
Well, I often tell people, if you favor your good leg, I always say it like that. If you favor your good leg, you will limp. Right?
Dang, that's good.
So that's what people do. If they're good at one thing, or they believe they're good at one thing. So if they believe they're good at dialogue, they'll lean so hard into dialogue, but won't learn anything about how to tell stories with pictures if they're writing a screenplay, because they can hide behind their strengths. Mm-hmm. And limp. And in fact, what often happens is if they're good at one particular thing, they will tell you those other things are not important. The kind of sour grape. Mm-hmm. Well, I don't need to know that because I'm so good at dialogue. Dialogue's the thing. Yeah. They'll make it the thing, and they won't go, yeah, I'm not good at that. I better lean into that and figure that out.
That's right.
It's a big problem. It's one of the hardest habits to break people of. But the people I know who are really good always gravitate towards the things they're bad at, and they will tackle them head on. Glenn Keane's like that. I have a friend at Pixar who's like that. We'll try to figure out what he's bad at and fix it. Right?
Yeah. And the coolest part about the framework is instead of going, well, I don't want to focus on that because I'm bad at it. It's like, no, you're training. It's like, that's what we're doing.
Yeah.
Majority of the time, you should be just thinking about where am I the weakest so I can get stronger. You're not losing. We're not even racing yet.
Right.
The hard part is if you haven't been training, and when it comes time to race, if all you've been doing is working on your biceps and you're running a race, guess what? Those biceps aren't going to help you. Yep. Right? Yep. There's a lot of people that know one magic trick, and then they get in front of an audience more than once, and the audience is like, we showed it to us last time. Right. What they should have been doing is they should have been focusing on their weakness. Just as a reminder, what we're doing with this series is this is all about training. It's like some of these concepts might feel like, beginner to you or whatever, but I promise the more you think about them and the more that you lean into it, or if you hear something that maybe you say on the episode, Brian, that you don't understand, instead of just assuming you misheard or whatever, it's like, read a book, figure it out, watch the movies that are referenced, all that stuff. That's all training, right? And it's all there to get you strong. So by the time you're ready to race, you're going to feel good about yourself instead of waiting for somebody to figure out that you don't actually know what's going on.
Yeah, and I think that there's also we don't have an educational system or society that says it's okay to be wrong. And so people always want to be right. And if they always want to be right, then they will always be in that racing mode and not in that training mode, because the training mode, they're wrong in there. So they don't want to be in that space, right? You and I are both dyslexic, and I always tell people about dyslexia. One of the great things about dyslexia, which is a horrible thing to go through when you're a kid, but one of the great things about it is it teaches you to be okay with being wrong, because you're wrong so often, right?
Yeah.
And so you're not as uncomfortable being wrong as other people seem to be. So you're less risk averse, where it's like, I'll try that, I'll into that. Or you're not discouraged if something takes you a long time to understand. Whereas the people I know who think they get things quickly, if they struggle with something for even just a little while, sometimes they're just like, they throw their hands up. It's too much. The anxiety is too much. And it's like, oh man, try being a dyslexic in the 5th grade and get back to me. you know.
Well, I told you I've been reading all those Chinese proverbs, right? And there was the one where it said, those who ask questions are a fool for a moment. Those who don't ask questions are a fool for a lifetime. Right? It's the same type of thing. It's like, be the one person that's brave enough to go, I don't understand what that word means. You just use the word gonculator. I don't even know what that means. Or, wait, hold on. Everybody else is going, yeah, we get it. And you're like, I still don't understand. Can you run that by me one more time?
Right.
You've said it tons of times that, like, the students that say, I got it, don't. And the ones that struggle with it are getting it at a whole different level.
Yep.
Right.
Yeah. The strugglers are the better students.
Training, the ones that know they're in training.
Yeah. They're always the better students. They don't feel that way. I'm always trying to explain it to them. And the people who think they'll stop listening. If people think they have it, they stop listening.
Brian, I've been in class where people show up and they think it's a race.
Right.
And you're like trying to set up like the first act of an idea. And they're going, hold on. What about Joseph Campbell? It's like, he's setting up the outer boundaries. He hasn't even got to the story yet. And because they think it's about them, and they're going, well, I got to make sure everybody else in the class knows that I'm here to race. And it's like, dude, none of us are racing.
Right.
We're all here just because we're trying to get stronger.
Yeah.
Fucking settle down a little bit, Yeah. And it distracts everybody else who's there just to train. Because this asshole over here is trying to prove that he's like race ready. And the funny thing about when people do that is they don't realize how weak they look to everyone else.
Yeah.
They think that posturing makes them look strong. And everybody looks at them and it's just like, will you shut up? We paid money to be here. Stop trying to prove how smart you are. If you were that smart, you wouldn't be in class to begin with. Right? You know what I'm saying? So let's just all go. We're all coming from a position of training, and let's try to learn something.
Right.
So that by the time we get a chance to race, we'll be ready.
Well, that reminds me, I've told you this story before. I think I've even talked about it on the show, but it's worth bringing up again, which is a friend of mine. He was visiting up from California, and we were walking around. And he ran into somebody he knew. And this was a young person. This is several years ago now. But this is a pretty young person, this woman he's talking to. And she said, I'm starting my own martial art. And to my friend. And I'm like, oh, okay. That seems weird for a young person. I mean, I just totally was like, really? You're starting your own martial art? Really? Those things take thousands of years to develop or hundreds of years anyway. Okay, sure. You're starting your own. Well, it's in the back of my head. And they have their conversation. She leaves. Now, my friend studied martial arts for a long time in his life and taught martial arts in Korea. Anyway, he studied for a long time, so he knows what he's talking about. And he said to me when she left, that woman is the best martial artist I've ever seen. And I was like, oh, really? And he said, oh, yeah. She has all these she knows all these different martial arts, like all kinds. And she's at the top of those things. Like if it's a black belt, that's what she's got or whatever it is. Her rankings are high in all these things. And he says, you know how she does it is that whenever she takes a new martial art, she doesn't tell the teacher that she knows anything. She comes in.
That's so smart.
Completely as a beginner, because she said, well, if you tell them you know something, they don't teach you everything. So
wow. Wait, hold on a second. You said if you tell them you know something, they assume things and they don't actually teach you everything.
Yeah.
That's great.
Isn't that? So I was like, oh, maybe she is making her own martial art. Good for her. Like I was like, okay, But yeah, that's how she did it, was always having a beginner's mind, which is a hard thing for people to do, because once you acquire a certain amount of knowledge or skill, you identify yourself by having that knowledge and skill, and it's hard to go back to zero. It's an ego. It's a bloated.
That's right.
Ego, right.
Yeah.
To be a beginner again, but it's amazing if you can get rid of your ego and start again every time, like it's new. It's amazing what you learn, and it opens the possibility that you may not understand things as well as you think they do, because now you're looking at it from another angle. And you're like, oh, I was completely mistaken about this because I was only looking at it from this perspective. But when you look at it over here, it looks like this. And now you have a fuller picture. But yeah, that's the best people I know are always people who do that. The best at what they do are the people who do that. Other people will just stick to their guns about their strengths and favor their good leg and limp.
When did you first become aware of this idea of outer boundaries? Am I saying that right? I always mess it up. Sometimes they say out of boundaries, but it's outer boundaries, right?
Outer shell.
Yeah,
or
I always mess that up.
Outer boundaries.
So when did you become aware of outer boundaries? And how'd you start seeing that? And B, what does that mean?
Okay. So the first time I sort of became aware of it was in 1982. When I saw John Carpenter's The Thing in the movie theater. The first act of The Thing, almost nothing happens. And then later, this dog turns out to be this creature, but you don't know any of that. You get a hint at it, but you don't know any of that. And I remember watching it, and at the very, very beginning of that movie, you see the Earth, and you see a spaceship that looks kind of out of control headed towards the Earth, and it sort of burns going into the atmosphere. So there's a spaceship. So that spaceship is a perfect outer boundaries, because what that allows you to do is say to the audience, there's going to be something here that is unusual, something, there's a science fiction element here. So even though you won't see that for a while, you have primed the audience to understand that that's possible within the confines of this reality. Right. And so that buys you all the time you need to set up characters, to set up whatever. And that creates the emotional context. So, there are people dying right now. As I talk, as we speak, there are people dying right now. Now, unless you know those people, that's essentially a statistic, right? Like, oh, people, sure, people are dying right now. But if you know them, that's different.
Yeah.
Right? Even if you know them a little bit, it's different. Oh, that's my neighbor. Oh man.
Yep.
That's right. It could be that, or the closer it gets, the more impact that's going to have on you. Right.
Yeah. And
so one of the things the first act does is create a relationship between the characters you want people to identify with and the audience. So that when the end of the first act, when something changes, they have an emotional response.
Yeah.
Now we live in a time when people say, just cut to the thing happening. And so that's what people do. They cut out the first act and they have the thing happen, but there's no emotional response.
Yep.
And so what
because there's been no time.
Yes.
Like literally, it seems like all your examples, you're saying the more time, if you're like, oh, my mechanic died, you're like, man, Joe died? Oh man, I bet Joe's been fixing my car for 15 years. That's going to hit you way harder than, oh, the barista died. And you're like, oh, that's really sad. I mean, I only met him once or twice. So time seems to have a lot to do with it, right?
I had a mechanic in Los Angeles. He was. It's
hard to find a good mechanic in Los Angeles. That's the only reason I was laughing, because I was like,
no, this guy was amazing.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
He was from Iraq. He was an Iraqi Christian. Couldn't have been a nicer guy. This guy was so cool that you would take your car. I would take my car to him and I'd say, and I was broke. This is, Los Angeles broke, where you're trying to make it in the movie business. There's no
Los Angeles broke.
You know what I'm talking about? Good. You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah. Oh yeah.
So, I bring my car in and I tell him what was wrong with it. And he goes, "Oh, that's going to be like $500, which might as well have been $1 million." Right. He said, "That's $500 probably." And I'm like, okay, fine, whatever. And so then he would fix the car and you'd go to get it. And he'd say, "Oh, it's not what I thought it was. It's $50.
Wow.
That's how cool that guy was. So I trusted this guy implicitly. Couldn't have been a more honest, nicer, just a sweet, sweet human being. One day I went in there. This was during the first Gulf War with George Bush the first. It's during the first Gulf War. So one day I went in and it was a whole different crew. Like there was my mechanic wasn't there. There was a whole different group of people. And I'm like, "Hey, I forget his name now." It's like, "Where is he?" And they're like, "Oh, he's not here. He's not going to be here anymore." I'm like, "What do you mean?" And they're like, "Well, somebody came in yesterday and shot him in the head because he's Iraqi. He didn't die." And I said, "Is he okay?" And they go, "Well, he's not okay." So I don't know what his condition was, but he didn't die from it, but it wasn't good.
Wow.
But what gives that the real impact is knowing who he was, right? I could tell you that story without telling you how honest he was and what a good guy he was. But that has a different impact than knowing what a good guy he does. That gives you something else. That gives you the context.
It would be a tragedy regardless.
Of course.
But there's something about being closer to him and knowing.
Yeah.
Right. And so if instead the story starts with, "I walked into my mechanic and I was like, 'Hey, where's everybody out?' And they're like, 'He's not here anymore.' Anyways, and then the guys fixed my car." It'd be like, well, I didn't really know what was the point of that story, Brian? Where were we going with that?
Right. Or if
apparently
I just said
the guy that used to work there got shot or something. I don't know.
Right. Yeah. Even if I said that, I walked in one day and my mechanic wasn't there because he'd been shot in the head because he was Iraqi. Like, I would still be tragic. Wouldn't be the same thing because you don't know him.
Yep. Yeah, that's right. Because you don't know him.
Yeah.
And the pressure, there's so much pressure because like you said in Thing or whatever, where they go, I mean, the funny thing is that it's like Hitchcock does this, all the greats do all this, where you're like, well, watch Rear Window. It seems like nothing's really happening at the beginning, or, it's like it's like everything is happening. Right. Everything is happening.
Right.
And if it's being done right, it will really matter later on.
Yep.
Everything. The shot of all the pictures framed, the one that pictures that not, the broken camera, all that shit. You're just like, it's just a bunch of pictures, and, a broken camera and, whatever. Grace Kelly comes in. That context is massive. It's massive. And now people really want to cut to almost the curtain of Act 1.
Right. Because
they want to save time. But imagine this. You're like, I don't need to date that person. We'll just get married. And you go, why? You're like, well, I want to save time. And you go like, some things are worth the time. Like, don't you want to get to know this person?
Right.
And you're like, no, that's all the boring stuff. Just cut to the part where we get married. You're like, oh shit.
Yeah.
It's about to get real fast. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's remember, you're spending time. I guess as long as you're not wasting time is different than investing time or spending time. Right. Like, if you're wasting the audience time, that's totally different. That's not what you're talking about.
No.
Because if all of a sudden you were bringing up a bunch of stuff and, all this stuff, it had nothing to do with what was coming in the second act, that's when you start wasting someone's time.
Yeah, well, that's another thing.
Also, can I say this real quick?
Yeah.
You didn't even have to think about that. Like you weren't thinking, you were just talking. This goes back to how everything you need to know about how to structure something, you can observe in a conversation. You weren't going, how do I make sure I get all my outer boundaries, pieces in? What your brain is naturally going, this is relevant, this is relevant. Your brain doesn't go, should I bring up the fact that he drove a Corvair? No, that's not relevant. You're just going, you're grabbing all this stuff when you're talking.
Right.
And at some point you went, that's everything I need. Now I'm going to transition into, so I came back the next day.
Right.
That's all that's happening.
Yeah.
This isn't magic. You're just pointing out.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, it's just the way we speak. It's the way we process information. It's the way we communicate in natural everyday speech. And that's all that's happening. You will have an outer boundaries. You'll do that. In fact, it's people will do it. They'll say, a lot of times when I talk story structure, people confuse that with chronology, right? So they confuse this like, well, so you mean it has to go in this order? I'm like, it doesn't have to go in that order. And so when they say things like, the people who have done story backwards or out of order, and they think that, oh, it's a different structure. It's like, it's not a different structure. Structure is structure, right?
Yeah.
Right. It all depends on what you're trying to build, right? So the structure for a house is different from the structure of a skyscraper, but it's still structure. It's still
right.
Principles apply.
There's still math. Like
right.
You can only put this much weight on this type of a beam, regardless of if it's a pyramid or whatever, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So here's an example of how people use an outer boundaries in their life that also ties into chronology. They might start a story by saying, I was in a terrible car wreck yesterday. Now that's the outer boundaries. That's the end, essentially, of the story. They're okay. They're standing in front of you, right? I was in a terrible car wreck yesterday. So I'm on the freeway. Oh, now they're back in time.
Yeah, that's great.
Right?
Yep.
Yeah. Because the outer boundaries, now you know what you're listening for.
Oh, my God. And for me, when people structure things properly, you don't get anxious. You ever had somebody who doesn't, if somebody doesn't give you an outer boundaries, I start getting frustrated. I'm like, I don't understand. Wait, what's going on? Am I missing this or whatever?
Yep.
You
don't know why
you're talking in code. In essence, what you're saying is, I know that this is how every human works, but I'm going to decide to not adhere to that.
Right.
And you go, why? Because I'm trying to make the point that I can start Star Wars as the Millennium Falcon lifts off and heads into space. And you're like, wait, who's this kid? Who's the Millennium Falcon guy? Why is there a big, furry, creature? Right. You'd be like, what the hell? Does anybody know what's going on?
Yeah.
It's like your uncle when he walked into Castaway late.
Yeah.
And he's like, I don't like that movie. It's like, you wouldn't pick your favorite movie, take out the first act. You wouldn't like it, I promise.
Yeah.
Take out the first act of The Godfather.
Yeah.
You'd be like, does anyone know what's going on?
Yeah.
Everything that you learn. Okay, Don Corleone, he won't kill this man for no reason. Now your daughter's not dead. All these things. There's this guy, Michael, right? This guy, Michael, now he went to war. He's not a part of the family business, and he's got this new girlfriend named Kay. There's this other guy who's kind of a sloppy drunk. Something about Fredo. He's probably going to come back later, and you're starting to realize his weakness. Take all of that away.
Yep.
And then drop somebody into that movie.
Yep. It doesn't, then it's bad all of a sudden. So you mentioned Star Wars, A New Hope, what the young people call episode 4, right? I call it Star Wars, but
so true.
Yeah. But it has a really great outer boundaries. You think the whole thing's this sort of sci-fi fantasy, the whole thing is in outer boundaries, but that's not true. So at the very opening of that piece, you see that little ship go overhead, and then that huge Star Destroyer, right? And it just keeps coming. I remember sitting in the theater, and it just kept going, and there was almost an audible gasp, like it just kept. Nobody had ever seen anything like this before, right?
Contrast,
But yes, it immediately tells you through that contrast what this thing is going to be about on some level. That you have a small ship against the big empire. You have a small group and you have a big, all-powerful group.
There's a planet over here for some reason.
Right. Right. Yeah. But right away they tell you like, oh, this is what's going on. Small, small person against big person, essentially.
Also look at the way that they're architected, everything, the colors of the ships, the whole thing. You're like, oh. Yeah.
So what you get there, you get the outer boundaries of Darth Vader and all of that stuff, right? And the droids.
Leia, all that.
All that stuff, right? Because then what happens after all of that is you see, even though it seems like it would be an Outer Boundaries, it's not. It's a pretty regular life that Luke has. He's got chores to do, and he's just some kid on a farm.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so
he's just trying to go into town and get some power inverters, and now all of a sudden he's got to go do this instead.
Yeah. Yeah. So he's just a kid with his crappy car, and and it's sort of it's not an Outer Boundaries in a strange way. So because later he's going to be sucked into this.
Oh world, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
But letting you know who he is, that he's just a simple farm boy, and he lives
with his aunt and uncle. That's interesting.
Yeah.
If you go back and you look at that and go, imagine taking that away. He doesn't meet old Ben Kenobi. Who's that? It's like, take that out. All of a sudden, think about even the droid interactions where it's like, who's this? Oh, she needs help or whatever. It's like all of that. If you said that's boring, get rid of it.
Right. Yeah.
What do you then? You go, well, then what are we doing here?
Yeah.
And also, I remember you explained to me one time, and I think you used Harry Potter, where you were like, you also have to explain all the stuff you can and can't do. So we find out we don't see Luke can't fly like Superman. Right. We do have these weird like sticks that light up, and there are robots that talk.
Right.
We know there's spaceships. Like you were like, if all of a sudden there was no droids, and then in the second act all of a sudden a droid walks up by, you'd be like, when did we start doing that? Right. Like, so can you talk about what you need to include in your Outer Boundaries?
Yeah. Well, one of the things you want to do, and now you have really the entire first act, right? You could save your Outer Boundaries and the reason I call it Outer Boundaries, by the way, it is the furthest thing, the most outrageous thing or impossible thing, whatever it is, it's the furthest out you're going to go that you're going to expect people to believe or swallow. Like, I just want you to believe that people can breathe in space. I need you to believe that. So you set it up right away and people will buy it. People will buy anything you set up right away. If you say a duck walks into a bar, people are like, okay, and then what happened? They don't question the duck walking into a bar, right? They okay, I get it. A duck walks into a bar. You can't spring that on them an hour into your story. Right.
Yeah, that's right.
Right.
Yeah.
They don't buy it. Right. So one of the things you're setting up is you're saying, these are all the things that are possible here. These are the rules here. And even if you have a completely fantastic world like Star Wars, there are still rules.
Yep.
Right. And you can't break those rules. When that happens, people will believe anything. But they have to believe it can happen in the world you've set up. So, so when that happens, people feel cheated. They often groan. There's some movies I can't talk about where people have talked about.
We talk about what this is from.
Oh yeah,
because I brought this in. This is from your office.
That's from my office. Mm-hmm. So that is that's from a Spielberg episode of Amazing Stories that he directed, and I mentioned it in Invisible Ink in the book. My mentor Bruce Walters worked on that episode, and so he had that original piece of art from that episode. And so when he read it in the book, he's like, I've had this for years. Do you want this? What are you kidding me? So I have that, but because it was given to them by the art director so they could match something. But anyway, so here's the deal. And we've watched it at Belief. I showed it and everybody felt what I was talking about.
Yeah.
Everybody felt it. They didn't even.
And there's so much craft in it too. Like the way he lenses that thing and everything. It's so good. There's such amazing work in it.
And I remember I saw it with a bunch of my friends. We were watching it as it aired for the first time, whatever it was, 1980, whatever it was. And we're watching it and we're into it. Like takes place during World War II. These guys are on a B-17 bomber. And so they're on this bomber. They're flying this mission across the English Channel to bomb something in Germany and then fly back. So they have a guy with them that they is their good luck charm. They call him their good luck charm, and he's been on a ton of missions. And they only let you fly so many missions back then because it was so dangerous and your life expectancy was short often as a person on a bomber, so a bombing mission. So they limited how many times you could do it. So anyway, this guy was past his limit, but he's our good luck charm. Come on, Captain, let him do it. So they let him do it. He's the belly gunner. So on a B-17, they had all these different guns to shoot, enemy aircraft and everything. And so one of the guns is on the belly of the ship. Is the belly on that drawing?
It is. It's in the very
back. Right there. Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's like a plexiglass ball, and the gunner goes down there and he sits in this plexiglass ball, and he protects the plane from underneath. So that's what this guy's job is. So he's in there. There's a lid. Whatever, he's in there. He's doing his thing. Turns out this guy wants to work at Disney Studios, so he's always doing these drawings and passing them. There's a little hole he can pass things through, so he'll do caricatures of all his crewmates and everything, and they think he's just the greatest. So they go on this bombing run, and they get hit. There's a fire. They're able to put the fire out, and they're coming home, and the guy wants to get out of the belly, and they realize that the fire has welded the thing shut, so he can't get out. And so they're like, okay, well, we'll find a way to get him out. And they keep trying to get him out. And they keep trying to get him out. And it is so intense because it just gets worse and worse and worse. And
it's Spielberg, so he's building it like crazy.
Yeah, too. Yeah. Because I'll tell you this. When it was over, my friend said it was awful. And I was like, no, it was good. That's the problem. That's why you're disappointed, because it was working. Because you get so invested. And then they try the landing gear and they realize the landing gear doesn't come down. So that means they have to land on their belly. And that means he will be crushed when they land. So they're trying everything. They're trying everything to get this guy out of there. And they can't get him out. They can't get him out. And finally they're like, well, the only thing we can do, they don't even say it out loud, but basically it's like, well, let's shoot him, so that he put him out of his misery. So his best friend is going to be the one who shoots him in the head. And he doesn't know that's happening, but he knows that he's probably going to die. And at one point, all the crew puts their hand through the little hole past the hole,
God,
and rubs his head. Yeah. And he's like, he's going to die, and they all know it. It's intense. And his friend is like, okay, he's got the gun and he's ready to shoot his best friend. And the guy is in the belly is drawing, and he's drawing that drawing. And he's like, I can't die. I'm going to work at Disney Studios. I can't die. I can't die. And he draws these wheels, those wheels you saw in that drawing, those big cartoon wheels. And then he's in this sort of trance, and they cut to the outside of the plane, and these big balloon cartoon wheels come out. And I remember we all groaned. And when I showed it at Belief, everybody did the same thing. Yeah,
it's like Roger Rabbit style, a real plane.
Yeah.
And the cartoon wheels pop out.
Yeah. And so they pop out. They're able to land on these cartoon wheels, and he doesn't die.
And then they take him out, and the damn thing crashes.
And it crashed. Yeah. And it was disappointing because it was working. But they made the reality, they made it so real that it's like, well, that can't happen. You didn't tell me that could happen. You lied to me. And this actually, what's the other thing that's important about that is that's a deus ex machina, right? That's a deus ex machina means God from the machine, right? And that came out of Greek theater when a hero would get in trouble. a playwright would write a play and the hero would get in trouble and there was no way out of it. And then at the end, they would have Apollo come out of the sky or somebody. And it was dissatisfying. Audiences were not satisfied with that. They want the hero to solve the problem. The reason I think that matters is because if you think of stories as I do and as you do, as survival information, we're watching the story to figure out how to get out of these things. We're watching the story to figure out how to survive. And if you cheat us out of that, then you haven't gotten anything. Right. So it's like, well, you didn't tell me how to live through this situation.
Yep.
Right. That's why it's so compelling. How's he going to?
Whereas the Miracle on the Hudson, similar type of a situation. Mm-hmm. Everybody's like, how did he do it? Whatever. Right.
Yeah.
And they paid it off. Yeah. I mean, it's a true story, but right. Yeah. You know, and there's tons of stories like that, but you're talking about lying. It's like, going like, well, really, if you don't do your outer boundaries correctly, it will feel like a lie because all of a sudden it's you cheated.
Yep.
There was no cartoons at all in the first or the second act. None.
Right.
There's these little drawings, but there's no like the difference is even in like a Roger Rabbit. First act, you see tons of cartoons walking around. You're like, in this world, it's like Mary Poppins. Like, it's like, well, in this world, or Ben does with broomsticks or something, you know, where you have to set up. There's magic here. It manifests itself in this way of like that. There's cartoons and people.
Yeah.
If you don't ever say that, it feels like a trick.
Right.
You feel dumb for having been like you literally you're watching. You're like, well, now I feel dumb that I was emotionally invested.
Right.
Right. Whereas you don't feel dumb for being emotionally invested in ET.
Right.
Right. But you do feel dumb for being emotionally invested in this show and caring about this guy.
Right. Yeah. It's
but you also said that in Raiders.
Yeah.
It's in there so that it doesn't become the same problem.
Right. The funny thing about Raiders of the Lost Ark is Raiders of the Lost Ark, literally, Deus Ex Machina is God from the machine or God from the box. Literally, God comes out of a box, right, and kills Nazis in that movie, essentially. How were they able to do that, right? Why did we swallow that? How were we able to do that? Well, that was it. There are a couple of reasons. So they had two kinds of reality to set up. So they had this. So they had their outer boundaries where at the beginning of Raiders of the Lost Ark, where you see Indiana Jones in the jungle and all of that, and then he goes into that old temple and steals the idol, and you see all the booby traps and all that stuff. And that's one kind of reality. It's sort of this ancient high tech thing that, with all the booby traps and everything. So like even the don't go into the light, there's like an electric eye almost or whatever. Like it's crazy in there, but that's one kind of reality, but that's not supernatural or metaphysical in any way. Right. So they've set up one kind of reality, but how do they get the God from the machine thing to work? Well, there are a couple of things. Throughout that piece, they are hinting, because this is the other way you can do it. You can give people little pieces of it throughout.
Yeah.
Right? So it's cool because what happens is you see Indiana Jones in the field with this crazy hyper reality, and then you see him in the classroom teaching. Right? If you start with him in the classroom teaching, it's much harder to swallow him being the adventuring guy later on. Right? Mm-hmm. So seeing him as that guy.
Super smart. Yeah. Super smart.
Yeah. So anyway, so the government guys come to see him and they say, Hitler wants this and you got to get it before Hitler and all of that. Well, what's really important is that he's explaining what the Ark of the Covenant is to these government guys. They don't know what it is. And they see the beam coming out of the Ark and killing this army, destroying this army. And they're like, what's that? And he's like, oh, it's lightning, fire, the power of God, if you believe in that kind of thing. Right. Because he doesn't believe that kind of thing. Right. And then later, his friend Marcus, Indiana Jones is packing to go to try to get the headpiece to the staff of Ra that's going to tell him where the thing is. Anyway, he's packing and to go to Nepal. And his friend Marcus comes over and he's like, Indy, you're going after the Ark. This is a big deal. This is a big deal. No one knows its power. No one knows its secrets. He's talking about the Ark. And Indiana Jones is like, what are you talking about? I'm going after this great archaeological find, and you're talking about the boogeyman, right? So he doesn't believe in any of this stuff, right? So that's really important to the story. It's one of the things people leave out when they talk about a problem with this story. We'll talk about that in a second. So
but he also shows the weapon.
Yes. Well, he shows the gun.
Yeah.
Yeah. He says, you know what a cautious fellow I am, right?
Which also shows, hey, there's no boogeyman as long as I got my gun.
As long as I got my gun. Now, that's true. That's true. Mm-hmm. The other thing you find out in the Outer Boundaries, by the way, is you find out like how he uses his whip and that he's good with a whip, right? That because you can't just pull that out later.
Yeah.
You don't believe that, right?
It's one of the first things we learn about him.
Yeah. Like, whoa.
You hear the gun cock and he looks and all of a sudden it's boom, 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 right?
Yeah.
Also, if you just analyze that little section of how the amount of different angles that Spielberg uses in that spot where you see his eyes click, 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 click. It's amazing. It's just amazing.
Yeah, there's some
and I don't want to gloss over something you said a second ago. We're talking about Kasdan, okay? When going from the action into him in the classroom, like you're like, yeah, people gloss over that. It wouldn't have worked the other way. Think about what he just said. One move and you don't believe the character.
Right.
But it shows how good this person was at their job.
Right.
He's like, I know I need to show Indy in this context because people will buy it in this context next.
Yeah.
That's craft. And you know it's craft because you didn't even notice it until Brian pointed it out. Right?
Yeah.
It just shows like, I just love it when you can start. That's why you call it invisible ink. Like, I love it when you start to see those things and go, wow, Lawrence is really good at his job.
Yeah. Lawrence
like, he's really good at his job. And it's like, yeah, man. And the coolest thing is now that you can see that and what he did, start watching other things. You're going to be able to start figuring out how to fix stuff. You'll be like, oh, but Kasdan fixed that like that. Oh, I should try swapping this thing. Oh, maybe I guess I need to, right?
Right. It also means that you see things, again, that other people can't see. And you'll say, oh, that didn't work. And you'll know why. And they'll say, oh, that's your opinion. You're like, no, I know now.
Yeah.
How much better that could be.
Yep.
You know? Because you'll have examples of it in your head. You know. So anyway.
But we also have an example that Indy can get out of situations. So we know that he's crazy savvy. So when he says, I take precautions, I got my gun, I got my whip, we're like, well, we just saw him.
Yeah, we know how good he is.
Whatever, him versus the world. So yeah, he's probably okay. He's not up against God or anything. Right. Everything is building.
You also know it's not perfect though. So like when he takes the idol, right, he weighs it out. So it's not, he's going to get out of these scrapes, but he's not going to not have scrapes, right? You know, he doesn't walk through unscathed.
He thinks he's smart, but sometimes it bites him in the butt. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So anyway, well, there's one point later on where he's going to try to get the Ark. And they're like, what are you going to do? And he's like, I don't know. I'm making this up as I go along. Right. Because he doesn't know how any of this stuff is going to work out either. But anyway, so he goes to see Marion, who isn't shown, but established that she exists in that first act before he gets on the plane. And she has the headpiece he's looking for. He doesn't know she has it because he goes and asks for it. And she says, I don't know where it is. Come back tomorrow. So he leaves her bar. She has this tavern in Nepal and he leaves. And the Nazis come looking for it.
Real quick, can I say one thing?
What? Yeah.
He also set up her outer boundaries.
Oh, yeah.
He doesn't open up with walking in and going like, hey, Marion, I need that headpiece. And she goes, come back tomorrow with $10,000.
Right. Yeah.
They don't do that. They take the time to set up who she is and how tough she is.
Yep.
Right. Again, there's outer boundaries that are happening in that scene, too.
No, that's true. Well, because you're establishing her. When she drinks that guy under the table. Yeah. Right. Later in the movie, she's drinking with Belloc when she's right. And
it's so good. I love it. I love that stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. It's so.
And you're like, no way she's that drunk.
Yeah. You know that she has a plan. And you know how much she can drink, how much she can put away. It's brilliant.
Yeah. When you start to see it, you're like, wow.
Yeah. It's brilliant.
Yeah.
So I jumped ahead to the Nazis coming to see her. That's not really important here. So what happens is Indiana Jones leaves and she takes out the headpiece. What which I have a replica of in my office.
Yeah.
She takes out the headpiece and she's looking at it. And she's kind of turning around and looking at it. And the camera is looking, in the foreground, there's a candle on the table. And there's a really great music cue. And there's a little wind that blows as she's looking at this. She even notices it, like, no, that's weird, but goes back. That's the first indication that there's something about this thing that may be more than maybe metaphysical or supernatural in some way. And that happens. They do these little hints. Later, there's a guy translating the writing on the headpiece, an old Egyptian man translating the writing on the headpiece. And as he's doing that, they're inside. There's more wind that time.
Yeah.
Right? There's more wind. And then later, when they find the ark and they're digging it up, it's a storm.
Yeah.
It's a storm, right? It's lightning. It's these roiling clouds, right? It's all that, right? How often is lightning used as symbolism for God?
Yeah.
Right? Lightning and thunder, right? Thor's the thunder god. Zeus uses lightning. Like, it's just a thing, right?
It's funny because, Brian, it was Thomas Foster wrote the book, How to Read Literature Like a Professor. Mm-hmm. And in there, one of the things he always says is, he goes, the rain is never just the rain. It's like the weather's never the weather. So if all of a sudden you're in the middle of Egypt and everything's fine,
right,
and then they start messing with this hill and it starts thundering and lightning, that should, the weather's never just the weather.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Unless you're a hack.
Right.
If you're a hack and you're like, why the hell was it raining? It had nothing to do with the story. You're like, I don't know. That's just somebody guessing or whatever, right?
Well, that's why I always say to people that you are not the master of your story. People are always like, you can do whatever you want. It's like, not really. No, not really. You can't. You don't get to do whatever you want. You have to do what the story requires, right? And so anyway, so you even get to that point where, you got all the thunder and the lightning as they dig up the ark. What most people remember consciously is the first time you see anything supernatural is when the swastika gets burned off the crate that has the ark. The Nazis have it, and there's a swastika, and the swastika burns off, and like a rat kind of dies, and and that's the first time most people go, oh, something weird is going on. But you've been primed the whole time to believe in this, right? So by the time you get to the end, and they open the ark and things happen, you've been primed for that. Like, oh, okay.
Also, what happens? Wind, fire, all the things that you've already explained.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So there's that. But this is the thing. Just this is a sidebar, which almost has nothing to do with the outer boundaries, but it's important. Lots of people have talked about this mistake in Raiders of the Lost Ark, which is that if you took Indiana Jones out of the story, he basically has no impact on the story, because the Nazis would get the ark, they would open it up, they would all be killed, they wouldn't have the ark, and so Indiana Jones had no impact on the story. I'm not sure how professional people don't see what's happening there.
Yeah, sure.
Because his arc is going from being a guy who doesn't believe in God and anything like that,
to saying, shut your eyes.
Yeah, to totally believing in it. That's his arc. That's the story. Right, right. The arc.
If he still didn't believe, he wouldn't say, shut your eyes.
Right.
Literally, he understands he's on holy ground. Like, it's like, what do you think that, okay.
Yeah.
The difference is, if Indy wasn't there, he wouldn't have learned that lesson.
Right. That's the whole thing. That's the reason. That's the reason to tell the story. Right. Yeah. And in fact, Indiana Jones is fighting for it when he's talking to the government. Government guys at the end, who's going to take care of this? This has to be studied. Do you know what this is?
Uh-huh.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. He's fighting for it differently too. Right. Do you know what this is that you have? To him, it's not just archaeology anymore.
Which is a clone at the beginning. When his buddy, when Marcus is going like, now, Indy, you know what you're going after, right?
Right, yeah.
He's like, yeah, whatever. Now the shoe's on the other foot.
Yeah.
It's just like in The Odd Couple. We've talked about that, where all of a sudden it's like, hey, get a coaster for that. It's like, okay, cool. Yeah. That's great. That makes sense. I almost feel like it's like this. It's like, make a list of the things the audience has to know.
Yeah.
Okay. It's Paddington. It's like, okay, he's a bear. He can talk. Okay. What else? He's from Peru. That's important. What else? He likes marmalade. Whatever the fuck. Like, it's like, okay, if you don't, all of a sudden you're like, when the hell did the bear start talking?
Right.
It's like, whatever the thing is, it's going, what has to be known in order for this to not feel like, again, okay, Harry Potter. Great. First thing you see, the lights start flickering. It's like, okay, there's some sort of magic here. Oh, this cat turns into a person. You can fly on a broom, but we only really see people on like a broom or whatever, right? Oh, he's poor. He lives under the stairs, yada, yada. There's owls, oh, here's how they get to school. Like if those things weren't there and you just opened up with Harry getting dropped off at the train station and he just walks through a wall and you're like, what is going on?
Right. Now, if that's an outer boundaries for some reason, you can do that, right? But if you're saying what you really want to say is this is a kid who thinks he's a normal kid, who's not a normal kid, right? Yeah. And so you have to set up the normal kid stuff.
Yep.
I don't like talking about television shows and movies that are current because you step on people's toes because they love them and they have an attachment to them. But one of the things I didn't like about Breaking Bad, now there's everybody switching off their computer who loves, oh, forget it. This guy doesn't like Breaking Bad. But one of the things I didn't like about it.
I also love that you explained it that they're switching it off. Like there's a big dial on the front of their computers. They're just, flipping it up.
But here's the thing. Vince Gilligan said he was going to take that character from being Mr. Chips to Scarface. Now, if you know Mr. Chips is a really he's a teacher, very sweet guy. They made a movie in the I think 30s, 39, I think, Mr. Chips. Goodbye, Mr. Chips. Anyway, he's very upstanding, very proper kind of character. And I'm like, well, you didn't do that. If that's what you said you were doing with Breaking Bad, you didn't do that. I never saw him as Mr. Chips. He never was Mr. Chips from the very beginning.
Yeah.
I know people think it's great, but I was like, well, he didn't do what he said he was doing.
It's just like the new Grinch that Stole Christmas, where he's not even a Grinch anymore. He's just annoyed. It's like all of a sudden it's like the Grinch has friends and stuff. You're like, why are we even telling this story? He goes from being annoyed to less annoyed, or it's like, okay, well, what are you trying to say? If you don't create enough distance, people won't be able to tell the difference. Right. It's like, don't argue with the floor and the distance you get, from a ways away, you can't tell the difference. It's like, well, it's like you need David and Goliath. You need to see Indy go from like, hey, I'm over here to like, whoa, be careful with that.
Right.
You need to be able to see that. Right. And if you never created that distance, it's going to be really, really hard for the audience to be able to keep up.
Yeah. Well, it's just harder to get invested because you're not watching a transition, or the stronger that the further polar opposite you can go. If you change somebody a little bit, there's really not much point to telling the story.
Yeah, that's right. If Scrooge was just kind of a little cantankerous and not as free flowing with his money as we'd like him to be,
right? He gives a little bit to charity.
Yeah. Right. You're like, okay.
Then he's not the same, right? Yeah. He has to be Scrooge. He has to be, a guy who won't give anything. He has to be, the guy who won't let his employee put a lump of coal on the fire.
A lump of coal.
Yeah.
It's so, because it's funny when you examine that, you go, it's funny.
Yeah.
Like a lump of coal, how far he pushed it, the contrast.
Yeah.
Like one lump. No. Don't go wasting a lump of coal on a fire in the middle of the winter. It's like he pushed it. Right.
Yeah. And a lot of people don't do that. They won't go far enough. It's That's a big thing. There's a lot of places where people don't go far enough.
Okay, think about this. Indiana Jones, think about what he does at the beginning of that movie. He goes into a cave. There's all these crazy booby traps, right? There's this beautiful glittering, statue. And then a giant stone ball rolls after him. Like, if you look at how far they pushed that, if you examine that, yeah, exactly. There it is.
Right.
Yeah. But if you look at how far they pushed that, it's awesome. I mean, it's awesome now. But I mean, if you were writing it, you're like, Eddie looks back. There's a stone the size of a small bus rolling towards him. You're like, wait, whoa. So the Aztecs went to a whole hell of a lot of trouble. It's like, yeah, but you always talk about theme beats logic, right? It's like, yeah, you got to push it.
Yeah. Logic, man. Logic kills more people in terms of their creativity because plenty of things are not logical in stories that people like. When people start picking apart logic, it means that they're not emotionally involved in the story. And they start saying, oh, well, that would never happen. And that would never happen. That's true of every story.
Why do bears need beds? Hold on a second. They need porridge? Right. Yeah, you lost me about 5 minutes ago. You're like, oh, okay.
Yeah. So there's lots of logic issues. As a matter of fact, you would think, well, if Goldilocks realizes that the third thing is always just right, wouldn't she start skipping the first two things as she goes along?
Right? Yeah, right, yeah. Very, very tidy bears, I guess, for her not to notice she was in a bear cave. Yeah.
So there's always a logic issue, right? It's all about whether or not what you need to tell the story, and whether or not that you've got people following along enough to understand why, what the point, like for instance, Groundhog Day is a really good example, right? Groundhog Day, and that's an example actually in a lot of ways of having that outer boundaries really.
Yeah.
Hit.
Yeah. Danny killed that. That's so good.
Right. Cause he doesn't really start with the crazy outer boundaries in the way that, like Star Wars or Raiders, but he does that thing because you can hold it, but it can't go any further than that, the end of the first act, essentially. Right. Other than now you've lost people, but you can do it. You can do it up till then. Now there's some great things he does that hint at it. They do the same thing in the movie Ghost. They'll hint at things in that way that sort of primes people. So, when Phil has to go to Punxsutawney yet again and he doesn't want to go, he says, because he's tired of going and doing this every year, and he says, somebody's going to see me doing this and think I don't have a future.
Yeah.
Right. But my point was that the studio wanted an explanation for why this was happening. It didn't work because you don't need it. Because people understand why it's happening. It's happening so that this guy learns how to not be a jerk.
Character's destiny.
Right?
Right. So what the character needs.
Yeah. Yep. So the Twilight Zone works the same way, right?
Oh, yeah, sure.
People understand in fact, Groundhog Day is really a Twilight Zone episode. It's just a long Twilight Zone episode, right? The character goes from thinking one thing and feeling one way to go being another way. It's totally a Twilight Zone.
Yeah. Your book, Old Souls, is a Twilight Zone.
It is a Twilight Zone.
If people want to read it, your version of a Twilight Zone episode, right?
Yeah, it's a Twilight Zone, right? So, because the Twilight Zone sort of doled out this sort of cosmic justice, right? Right. So the mean people, for the most part, the mean people got what they deserved, and the good people got what they deserved. There were a couple of times when they broke that formula. Those are not my favorite ones. I think they, within the context of the show, set up a reality. And sometimes they broke that because I think that reality just came out of who Rod Serling was. And I don't think he analyzed it. I just think he wrote, that's just the way he thought things should be, right? That this cosmic justice, I think that was just in him. And so when they broke that, he was going against who he was in a lot of ways. But he didn't understand it intellectually. I don't think that's what he was doing.
But okay, so to take the Twilight Zone, that's a great TV show to learn how Outer Boundaries works.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
If you go look, like, I'm just thinking about the big ones at least, but like you just go like, wow. I mean, they take the time to set the frame, right?
Yeah.
And so, again, the coolest thing about this, if you think Brian's just, I don't know, blowing hot air or whatever, it's like, then just go home tonight and listen to somebody talk and try to make sense of what they're saying without those outer boundaries, right?
Yeah.
Because if you don't get that, you don't even have a chance, not only to tell a story, but the most important thing, you don't even have a chance to affect someone emotionally. Because in the same way that you read the newspaper, it's like, a person died today in whatever, Seattle, Washington. You're like, oh, that's too bad. Versus like, your best friend died. You're like, that time, getting to know someone changes everything.
Yeah. You mentioned Old Souls. And I had, it was originally a screenplay. And when I had a manager at the time who basically asked me to take the outer boundaries out of the script. And it's like, you can't understand what you're asking me to do. And I didn't mean that as an insult. It's just, he couldn't have understood, because once he read it, he couldn't unknow the outer boundaries. Oh,
that's interesting.
Right. Because you don't need that. I'm like, you can't say that, because how what's coming, So Old Soul starts with people reminiscing about ways they've died.
Yes.
One time I died like this. One time I died like that. Another time I died like this. And then you see a guy going on with his regular life. He works at a mall, right? There's nothing crazy that happens there really that couldn't happen in real life.
Right.
Right. But what that does is it allows me the time I need to get to know the character, to get to know what their life is like before I disrupt that life. Right.
Yeah.
With what comes next. So it's like, oh, so you have to know who this person is, what his family life is like, all that stuff.
Think about it's like, how do you make Die Hard without setting up who John McClane is,
right,
and his relationship with his wife? If all of a sudden it starts with the taking over of the tower, and you got this guy who's barefoot kicking ass, and all of a sudden you know that you can tell that they don't want him to find out who it is. Oh, I didn't know they were married. Why is that important? It's like, that's the whole. What do you mean? Why is that important? Right.
Yeah.
I mean, think about it. Argyle, everybody. If you don't know those things, it's then what's the point?
Yeah. There's a great thing in that movie. There's a lot of great things in Die Hard, but there's a really great thing in that movie where, when he comes to visit her, he lives in New York. She's moved to California to take this job, and they're not divorced, but they're separated and whatever. And you see them and they're kind of getting along, and then they have an argument about her moving out and all this stuff. So
her name was changed in the computer.
Yeah. Her name was changed to her maiden name. And so
she's like, well, it's a Japanese company. And he's like,
Yeah. But they have this argument. They have this fight. And anyway, later on, when the place has been taken over by the bad guys, and John McClane is like thwarting all their plans, and his Bruce Willis's wife, John McClane's wife, is sitting there as one of these guys runs through the room and he smashes something, and she says, "He's still alive." And her friend says, "How do you know?" It's like, only John can make somebody that upset. It's the greatest thing in the world.
And there's that scene where they ask her name and she gives her maiden name.
Right.
And you're like, oh, so it ended up protecting her just like she thought it would. And you're like, oh, maybe John's not right about everything.
Right.
It's all that stuff where you're like, it's just really well constructed. All I'm saying is, if you just start with like, but it doesn't really, the shooting doesn't even start until they take over the building. Why don't we start there? That'll be a cool way to open it. Blah, blah, blah. You're like, okay, it would have been just another action movie. That came and went. It would not have been Die Hard. Everybody's favorite Christmas movie or whatever. Right.
Yeah. Well, I mean, It's a Wonderful Life, another favorite Christmas movie, starts with angels talking about George Bailey.
Yep.
Right. That's an Outer Boundaries. Then you just see George Bailey's life, and it's pretty normal. There's nothing There's no angels in his life, right? Right. It's a pretty normal life. That's the way you do it. E.T.'s the same thing, right? You start with E.T. with all the other aliens, and then E.T. gets left behind. Then you see Elliot and his life, and it's normal, and there's no, it's just.
And Capra brought the angel back at the end too.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
And you're like, wow, they just moved this relationship from heaven to earth, right? Between a father, son, spirit. All of a sudden it's a father holding his daughter, and the bell rings, and she's like, every time a bell rings, angels gets away. And good old Clarence or whatever. I'm just sitting there going like, oh my God, these people are so good at their job. Just like, holy shit. It's still cyclical.
Yeah.
He just brought it down to earth, just like Christmas. I mean, it's like, oh my God, this, it's just like, wow, that's talk about just dunking on everybody. You're like, wow, that was so well done.
It's interesting too, what people don't notice about The Wizard of Oz is The Wizard of Oz doesn't have like early on kind of outer boundaries in the same way that we're talking about, right? That outer boundaries is right. It's that first act curtain is the outer when the tornado lifts her up and she goes out and it's color. Then you go, oh, I'm into the second act, right? When it's color, right?
Yeah.
But that whole first act sets up the three friends because it's the same three, right? Sets up when she runs away and she meets the Professor Marvel, the fake like Swami guy. It's the same guy that is the wizard later. There's a witch
all there
who wants her dog, right?
Yep.
right. It's all there. It's all the same actors even, but it's all the same thing, right? Because that goes to the point, which is that she already had what she was looking for. She had all the same things. Right. So it's a really great outer boundaries because it's sort of a thematic outer boundaries.
Yeah. It's so great.
Yeah.
Even the name, like what did you know, Mr. Marvel or it's the off to see the Oz. It's the same shit. They both have bullshit titles. It's great. They're all just pretending. It's so really nice. Awesome. Okay, so hopefully today was some training for folks. No need to race yet, right? But we learn this stuff so that when it's time for a race, we're ready. So thank you, Brian, for this. If you want to learn more about this, specifically outer boundaries stuff, not only I would check out Brian's blogs, but really, if you haven't read Brian's book, Invisible Ink, I would definitely check it out because you go even more in depth in there. So thank you, Brian. Appreciate it.
Yeah, sure. Thanks.
This program is produced in Seattle, Washington by Belief Agency.